Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at a really a quite magnificent bird, the Sarus crane, specifically in Nepal's Lumbini province.
Hmm.
We've got this recent study conducted just last year, June 2023, and it gives us a really interesting window into how local communities there see these cranes.
That's right. And the Sarus crane, it's more than just a big bird, isn't it? It's globally vulnerable, lives in these wetland and farming areas right alongside people, often outside the big national parks.
Right, not in protected zones necessarily.
Exactly. And it has huge cultural significance in Nepal. Plus, ecologically, it tells us a lot about wetland health. So, understanding what local people think and know, it's absolutely crucial for saving them.
Absolutely essential. And this study, it really gets boots on the ground talking to, 459 people across 4 districts there in Lumbini.
Good sample size, yeah.
So our mission today really is to unpack this relationship. What are the threats these birds face? What did locals think about conservation?
And it's key to remember, these aren't pristine wildernesses we're talking about. These are landscapes heavily shaped by farming. So the attitudes of the people living there are just fundamental.
Okay, let's dive right in then. The first thing that jumps out, and it's pretty striking, is just how well-known the crane is. 99% of people they ask could pick it out from a picture.
It's incredible, isn't it? 99%. So you see, the bird is definitely familiar. It's part of the scenery.
No question there.
But that familiarity, well, it doesn't automatically translate to knowing it's in trouble. But it's a good start, a warm entry point, you could say.
And where did people say they usually see them?
Mostly in farmlands, actually. That was 37%. And then wetlands were next, about 25%.
Okay, so really integrated into those agricultural areas.
Very much so. Living side by side with farming life.
Now, okay, so they recognize the bird, but what about knowing what it eats? Was that as clear?
Well, that was a bit more varied. About 35%, so just over a third, thought they were omnivores, eating a bit of everything.
Which is, generally speaking, correct.
Broadly, yes.
Right.
But then you had smaller groups with different ideas.
Yeah.
14% thought only invertebrates, 12% only vertebrates, 8% only plants.
Quite specific.
Yeah, and about 3% just said they weren't sure.
So a bit of a mixed bag on the diet knowledge.
Exactly. And, while many have a basic idea, these differences show where maybe some targeted education could help just to clarify their role in the ecosystem a bit more.
Makes sense. Okay, what about nesting? Did many people report actually seeing Sarus crane nests?
Fewer. Definitely fewer. Only about 36% said they'd seen a nest.
Less than half, yeah.
And for those who had seen them, almost half, 49%, saw them in farmland.
Again with the farmland.
Yep. And then 31% in wetlands, and a smaller group, 12%, had seen them in both kinds of places.
So the fact that fewer people have seen nests, what might that suggest?
Well, it could be a few things, couldn't it? Maybe the nests are just hard to spot, well hidden. Or, and this is a bit more concerning, maybe nesting success itself isn't that high in these areas.
Meaning fewer nests around to be seen.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Something to keep in mind when we talk about population trends later.
Right, good point. Because this next part is, well, it's quite stark, actually. Despite almost everyone knowing the bird, awareness of its conservation status, the fact that it's officially listed as vulnerable globally and in Nepal.
Yeah, how was that?
Extremely low. 95% of people did not know it was vulnerable.
95%? That's a huge disconnect, isn't it?
It really is.
People see the bird, they know the bird, but they don't know it's actually facing a pretty high risk of extinction in the wild if things don't change.
Yeah.
That's critical.
Absolutely critical. There was slightly better awareness, though, that it's a protected species in Nepal, one of the 9 protected birds. About 25% knew that.
Okay, so a quarter knew it had some kind of legal protection?
Yeah.
Still not very high, but better than the awareness of its vulnerable status.
Yeah, still leaves 3/4 who didn't know even that. And this lack of awareness seems to carry over to the consequences of harming them.
You mean like penalties for hunting?
Exactly. Only about 32%, less than a third, knew there were penalties for killing or hunting Sarus cranes.
Right. And the study found that didn't really vary much with age or education.
No, it seemed pretty consistent across the board. Gender, education, age, none seem to make a big difference in knowing about the penalties.
That's definitely a concern. I mean, if people aren't aware there are legal consequences, it obviously weakens the deterrent against poaching or harming them.
Stands to reason.
And it probably links back, like you said, to just not knowing they're vulnerable in the first place. If you don't think they're threatened, why would you expect strict penalties?
True. Okay, let's shift gears a bit because it wasn't all concerning news. What about attitudes? How do people generally feel about having these cranes around?
Well, this is really positive, overwhelmingly positive, in fact. 98% of people said they liked the Sarus Cranes.
98%. Okay, so people really appreciate them.
They really do. And the reasons they gave were interesting, too. The biggest factor, for 63%, was just their physical beauty.
They are stunning birds.
Absolutely. Others mentioned their appearance and their calls, some just the calls, some the courtship dance.
Ah, yes, the dancing.
Exactly. And then smaller numbers mentioned things like being a friend to farmers or their religious and cultural significance.
So a lot of positive associations there.
Definitely. And that's such a valuable foundation for conservation. People already have this positive connection. The challenge is to link that feeling to the need for active protection.
Right, bridging that gap. Now, you mentioned some saw them as a friend to farmers. Did the study dig into perceived benefits or harms in farmland?
It did. And it was a bit split. About half, 51%, actually thought the cranes offered no direct benefit in their fields.
Oh, okay. So not everyone saw them as helpful.
No, but about a third, 34%, did think they were beneficial, helping control pests, maybe enhancing productivity.
Interesting split. And what about the flip side? Did people worry about crop damage?
Mostly no. A large majority, 80%, said the cranes didn't damage crops.
That's good.
But 17% did report some damage, mostly to things like peas, lentils, maybe young rice plants.
Okay, so not a widespread issue, but a concern for some farmer.
Exactly. And that 17%, well, it's important. Even if it's a minority view, that perceived conflict needs to be managed to keep overall attitudes positive. And maybe highlighting the pest control aspect more could help too.
Yeah, showing the benefits might outweigh the occasional damage for some. Okay, now let's talk about what people are actually seeing happen to the cranes and their environment. What did they perceive about population trends?
Well, the perception was generally one of decline. A majority, 59%, felt that the distribution range, the areas where you can actually find Sarus cranes, had shrunk over the last decade.
And why do they think that was happening?
They pointed to the usual suspects, really. Habitat problems, direct threats like hunting, food becoming scarcer, and electrocution risk from power lines.
So local people are noticing a contraction.
Seems so. Only 15% thought the range had actually increased.
And what about nesting sites specifically?
Similar trend perceived there. Almost half, 48%, thought nesting sites had decreased.
Okay, so fewer places to nest, possibly shrinking range. What about the overall number of birds?
Again, the perception leaned towards decline. 55%, over half, believed the actual population was going down. Only 13% thought it was increasing.
That perception of decline, it matches the official vulnerable status, doesn't it?
It does align, yes. It suggests people on the ground are observing changes that reflect the wider conservation concerns.
And you mentioned something earlier. Did the study find any difference in perception based on gender here?
Yes, interestingly, it did. There was a significant association between gender and the perception of population trends.
How so?
The study notes the association but doesn't detail the specific difference in this summary. But it highlights, that different groups within the community might see things differently or perhaps have different levels of exposure or observation.
Interesting nuance. Worth remembering that different perspectives matter. Okay, so people perceive declines. What about direct threats they've actually witnessed? Was hunting a major observation?
Thankfully, most people, 71%, said they hadn't personally seen hunting.
That's somewhat relieving.
It is. But a significant minority, 18%, had witnessed hunting.
Still nearly 1 in 5. That's worrying.
It is. And it wasn't just hunting. 10% reported seeing people collecting eggs or chicks.
Oh, that's terrible for breeding success.
Absolutely. And 8% had witnessed electrocution or collisions, likely with power lines or vehicles.
So various direct threats being observed. When asked broadly, what did people identify as the biggest threats overall?
The most frequently mentioned threat, by 44%, was habitat loss and degradation. That came out top.
Makes sense for a wetland bird in an agricultural landscape.
Exactly. Followed by hunting and poaching, mentioned by 19%, and then wetland drying and degradation specifically at 16%.
So habitat issues and direct persecution are the main concerns people see.
That seems to be the local perspective, yes.
Now, given these perceived threats and declines, are people aware of any conservation efforts happening in their areas? Any programs?
Well, this is another striking finding. A huge majority, 89%, reported that there were no conservation awareness programs happening in their locality.
89%. Almost everyone felt nothing was being done, or at least nothing they were aware of.
Pretty much. It really points to a big gap.
Yeah.
Whatever conservation work might be happening, it doesn't seem to be reaching or engaging the vast majority of these local communities.
That seems like a massive missed opportunity, especially given the positive attitudes people have.
Absolutely. You've got people who like the bird, see it's declining, see the threats, but aren't aware of any organized efforts to help.
Okay, but despite that lack of awareness of programs, do people think the cranes should be conserved?
Oh, overwhelmingly, yes. 96% believe Sarus Cranes should be conserved. Huge support there.
That's fantastic. Do they have ideas on how?
They did, and quite practical ones, too. The top suggestions were things like controlling hunting, that was 23%, then wetland management at 22%, followed closely by awareness campaigns at 21%.
So basically addressing the threats they identified.
Precisely. Other suggestions included general habitat protection, stricter laws, reducing disturbance around nests, controlling pesticide use, and even insulating power lines.
A good range of sensible measures. And whose job did they think it was? Who should be responsible for this conservation?
That was interesting. Quite varied views. About 22% said local communities themselves. 15% pointed to the national government. 13% to the local government. Then you had combinations. 11% said local people and local government working together. 6% said local and national governments collaborating. And quite a large group, 21%, just said everyone.
Everyone. I like that. A shared responsibility.
Exactly. It shows an understanding that it needs a multi-pronged approach, but maybe also some uncertainty about who should really lead the charge. The key thing, though, is that willingness to see action taken.
Definitely. Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. As we wrap up this deep dive, what are the main takeaways for our listeners from this study?
Well, I think the first big thing is this picture of significant human-caused threats, potentially leading to declines right there in these farming landscapes.
Yeah, the threats seem real and perceived by locals.
And crucially, there's a limited local knowledge about the crane's vulnerable status, its legal protections, and a real lack of visible conservation initiatives on the ground.
That contrast really stands out, doesn't it? High recognition of the bird itself,
Almost universal.
but very low awareness of the conservation issues. Why do you think that is?
Well, the study suggests it might be because conservation efforts historically have maybe focused more inside designated protected areas. These landscapes fall outside that, so perhaps education and outreach just haven't penetrated as much.
Leaving a gap in these really important shared landscapes.
Exactly, and that link between not knowing the status and not knowing the hunting penalties seems pretty direct too.
Right. We also saw really positive attitudes linked to beauty and culture, but maybe a need for more understanding of their ecological role.
Yeah, especially the potential benefits like pest control. That could strengthen support further. The positive attitude is a huge asset, but linking it to ecological understanding and the need for conservation is key.
And the perceived declines in range and population, they seem directly tied to the threats people are seeing, like habitat loss, wetland degradation, egg collection.
Yes, the local observations seem to echo the scientific concerns. It adds weight to the urgency.
But the final key takeaway has to be that strong local support for conservation, right? People want to protect these birds.
Absolutely. That 96% figure is incredibly encouraging. It signals a real willingness within the community to be part of the solution. The need now is for collaborative efforts that actually tap into that willingness.
So building bridges between that local goodwill and effective conservation action involving everyone from communities to different levels of government.
That seems to be the path forward based on this evidence. Collaboration and targeted education are vital.
Okay, so this brings us to a final thought for you, our listener, to maybe ponder. Given this deep cultural connection, calling it the bird of Buddha in some contexts, what are the deeper, maybe long-term consequences if this iconic bird continues to decline, especially outside the formerly protected parks in these everyday landscapes?
It's a powerful question. Losing a species is always tragic, but losing one so culturally embedded, what does that mean for local identity, for that connection to nature?
And on a more practical level, what role can individual awareness, our awareness, listener awareness, and maybe action play? How do we help bridge that gap we identified between just recognizing a bird and actively helping protect it, especially in these landscapes where humans and wildlife are trying to coexist?
Yeah, how do we move from passive appreciation to active stewardship in these shared spaces? Something for all of us to think about, I believe.
Definitely food for thought. Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.